Okay, I had a very good question to start with. What is manifold pressure, since I'm bringing it up all the time? You don't have manifold pressure in your car. It's not something that is important. I don't know, maybe if you have a turbocharger, you've got a little gauge or something. But I think it's just for looks because turbo is controlled by a bunch of stuff. You don't get to control it. But in aircraft, manifold pressure, piston aircraft, manifold pressure is very, very important, not especially if you have a constant speed, only if you have a constant speed. If you have a fixed pitch prop, you don't care, it's just whatever. It's no different than a car, it's just there. Nothing you can do about it, so don't worry about it. But if you have a constant speed propeller, that's like having a gearbox. And I'll probably take you guys in and we'll fire up the simulator and I'll kind of show you manifold pressure, how it works. But manifold pressure is literally the pressure in the intake manifold between the carburetor and the cylinders. And why it's important, number one, is because we're dealing with altitude changes. So as we go up in altitude, the air pressure around us is less, therefore your manifold pressure is less. So it's something to consider. But in a constant speed propeller, as opposed to something with a fixed pitch, if I have a fixed pitch, 150, 170, 172, something like that, and you hit the throttle, go to the firewall, the engine is going to speed up to a certain point. Let's just talk about your 290. Okay, that takes a fixed pitch prop, and that has a red line of, I forget, what was it? It was either 28, let's say 2,700, because it's a common one. So let's just say red line on your aircraft is 2,700 RPM, right? It's right on the needle, can't go past 2,700. Well, interesting that when you get in an aircraft, fixed pitch prop, put your feet on the brakes and go firewall, because the throttle goes forward as fast. Firewall that thing. It will not go to 2,700. It will not go to red line. It actually goes to a very narrow range, which we call the static RPM. And if you look up a type certificate on an aircraft, because an aircraft includes a propeller, a specific prop, and a specific engine, if you look up the type certificate data sheet on a particular aircraft with a fixed pitch prop, it will say the static RPM shall be a minimum of and a maximum of. It's a very narrow range. And it's, let's say on an aircraft that had a red line of 2,700, it'd be around 2,400. And what that does is it checks the power output of the aircraft. So when I had my little 150, right? So every year at annual, I would, before I did the annual, I would take it out, warm it up, do a static RPM check and note the static RPM. Well, if, last year it was 2450 and this year it's 24 and I lost 50 RPM, it tells me I've got a power loss. So it's just something to be, to consider. Now, an aircraft with a constant speed propeller, the propeller blades will always change the angle to change the RPM of the engine. So my 182, if I want to do this static RPM check, I get in on a firewall it, and my red line is 2,400. It goes wham! It slams right there at 2,400 RPM. And if it isn't at 2,400 RPM, it means my governor's not adjusted. And I turn off the engine and I get out and I just adjust the governor till the blades if it's going too fast, I'll either take more of a bite, the blades, or I'll flatten them out a little bit. And we'll talk more about that when we get into propellers and stuff. But constant speed aircraft do not have static RPM. They just go to red line. In a fixed pitch prop, I got my feet on the brakes, I go full throttle, it goes to 2,400. I let off the brakes, that RPM starts climbing as the aircraft moves forward because of the way the relative wind hits the prop and such. In a constant speed prop, as I release my brakes and start to roll, it's just going to stay at 2,400. What happens? Well, just take a bigger bite. It'll keep it 2,400. I start climbing. It takes less of a bite. Just keeps it right at 2,400. So it's always going to be right at red line unless I pull the throttle way back and there's just not enough power to do it. The blades are as flat as they can go and it's not enough power. But otherwise, as soon as I take off, I pull back my throttle. Now, if you pull the throttle back a little bit, it's going to stay at 2400 because that's what a constant speed prop does. It's set for 2400. And so the throttle becomes a manifold pressure. You just move that, you just watch the manifold pressure go up and down. You want to change RPM, you reach over and you grab the blue knob and you pull that out, and that makes more of a bite of the prop, and then the RPM is going to go down. And it sounds kind of confusing, but once you're doing it, it's like, oh, it makes perfect sense. Like I said, we'll get somebody have to remind me, we'll fire up the simulator and I'll just show you on the simulator how it works. So with a constant speed prop, when I look at a power table and I say I'm going to go up to 10,000 feet and I want to cruise at 65% power, I look at a table and it tells me then my manifold pressure should be this and my RPM should be that. And so you can adjust your manifold pressure and your RPM to match. It becomes even more critical if you have a turbocharger because you have to keep the manifold pressure within certain limits. So I don't know, that was a long explanation, but sometimes you really care what manifold pressure is and sometimes you don't. For the purposes of this class, we're going to talk about manifold pressure as something that has to do with power, how our power works, or the power we get, I should say. So we are going to talk about, and I've got my calculator out. Oh, I know. Compression ratio. All right, so compression ratio. The compression ratio. So ratio is a comparison of two things. So what two things is the ratio? Ratio is the ratio of the volume of the cylinder at bottom dead center versus top dead center, TDC. So what they do to figure this out is you take a cylinder, bolt it on the engine, you take the piston, you move it all the way to bottom dead center, plug up one of the holes and you fill it with the liquid, oil, water, whatever you want to do. And then you take the propeller and you take the piston and you push it, and you take this and you put it into a cup, and you go all the way forward, and whatever it pushes out, that is, well, that's a displacement, sorry. So the compression ratio is the volume. So what you do is you take piston all the way down the bottom, and you could fill it all the way up and say, okay, well, how much did that hold, right? And then drain it all out, then put the piston at top dead center, fill it up again because there is room there, and measure that. Say how much is there with the top, and how much is there at the bottom. That's what I wanted to say. The other one was displacement. So that is the compression ratio. So if a cylinder, contains, I have an example, 50 cubic inches of, we'll say fluid or air. Doesn't matter how you want to do it. It's just easier to measure fluid than it is air. At bottom dead center, and 10 cubic inches. That's inches with the 3. 10 cubic inches of fluid at top dead center. Then the compression ratio is, well, 50 to 10. We can divide both sides by 10. We get 5 to 1. All right, so compression ratio, it's a big deal. Increasing the compression ratio, I'm going to say CR, compression ratio. Increasing the compression ratio increases power and efficiency. So, but we have a limit. We can only go so far. Whose car takes premium gas? All right. What do you have?
A Civic.
A Civic.
That's turbocharged.
Is that factory?
No.
Okay.
Recently.
What do you have? You
530.
have a 530E?
No.
530
Is that a Mercedes? Nice. 530.
plug-in hybrid.
530E Mercedes?
No. BMW, sorry.
BMW. Okay, that's why I didn't understand. Like,
Said
really?
yes to Mercedes.
Okay, so yes, BMW, Mercedes. What do you have? BMW. Yeah, all your premium German autos, they all take premium. Why do they take premium? Well, because they have very high compression ratios in them. And they do that so they get a lot more power out of it. So, I don't know, I had the E350, which I think was a 3.5 liter at that point, that had 300 horsepower. So, you know, little V6. Well, of course, that's not much anymore, but, right? What is Mustangs? Hot Mustangs take that? Anyway, so they had I don't know, there's somebody I know. Anyway, so when you increase that compression ratio, you then need premium gas. Why do you need premium gas? Well, we'll talk a lot more about the next class, but because you have the octane rating is higher. The octane rating has to do with detonation. Detonation is when fuel doesn't burn evenly. And it's the difference between what we want is the fuel to burn, which would be like if I had to move this desk from here to that wall, and I'm doing it properly, I would come over here, kind of get on it and give it a push, and then a little push. But detonation would be like me using a sledgehammer to do it, just kind of whack, you know, and that's detonation. So it's hitting the piston with a sledgehammer effect one time, and then it goes, well, that just hammers the piston, it erodes the piston, it ruins the bearings, it bends the rods, it does all kinds of damage. So if we increase the compression ratio too much, we're going to get detonation. Detonation, also called pinging. What you're hearing is an explosion. And aircraft, your car has a computer that listens for that. And when it hears that, it does things like back the timing off or change the fuel air ratio to stop the pinging. In an aircraft, not only do we not have the computers to control that, you can't hear it because the prop makes too much noise and we have short stacks and the engine's very loud, and so you ping away. Your first indication usually that your engine is detonating, if you're not watching EGT, would be that it quit. Like, wow, it quit. Guess that was detonation. Just burn a hole through the piston. So
It's not moving.
there's an indicator. Yeah. So, anyway, so compression ratio too high. So compression ratio too high, and we're going to talk so much about fuel and mixtures and all kinds of stuff in the next class. Causes detonation too high. Causes causes detonation. That's bad. Detonation, and then it's a detonation like hitting the piston with a hammer versus pushing. It causes engine failure. So higher compression ratio. So high compression ratio engines need higher octane fuel. And of course, octane is those numbers that you have on the pump when you stop there to get gas in your car. 91's the highest, 87's the lowest in California, and then the middle is 89? Okay. In aviation, they've had so many different fuels, but you know, when I started flying, you could have, we called it 80-87. So they give you two numbers for the same thing. Or you could have 100. Now we just have 100 octane. Let's see. So typical, yeah.
The difference in the octane, because there's 100 low lead or there's 110. I don't remember if it's 110 low lead or if it's just 110. That 10 units of octane, most aircraft to count say you could use either or, but technically it's a different octane. What effect does that have?
Well, the only fuel I know that we have right now on airports available to us is the 100 low lead, 100 octane low lead.
Right.
So the other fuels have been antiquated and are gone. So the last 30 years, 40 years, you've only had two choices, and the last 10 or 20 you've only had one choice. So back then you could get 80, 87, or 100. Just like your car, it doesn't hurt anything to run higher octane. It really ruins it really fast if you run lower octane. Did that answer the question? Okay, yeah, it doesn't hurt to go higher octane. There's more to it than that because for us, aviation, to get the higher octane, they just dump more lead in it. And so that lead creates problems. So you have lead problems. So you can't just say, well, it's just, it wasn't like no problem. There is a problem. It was lead. That we deal with it. Typical compression ratio for aircraft, let's see, is about 7-to-1. It's going to depend. Lycoming states low compression is 6.5 to 1 up to 7.9 to 1. And while I'm thinking about Lycoming, just to give you an idea, so Lycoming made the 0320 engine, which is, like I said, one heck of an engine. I think that's probably the most common engine in the world. Very good 4-cylinder engine. Like I said, that was the 350 of the sky, Chevy 350. But anyway, or the 351 if you're a Ford fan. I'm sorry. They made it in two versions, 150 horse and 160 horse. The only difference between the 150 horse and the 160 horse was the piston part number. Just change the piston, you went from 150 to 160 horsepower. There's some other nuances if you had it old enough, but narrow deck, wide deck, and stuff. But really, the only difference was it's just the piston. Continental, they had the A65, very old engine. You could convert that to an A75. Actually, that one you had to increase the RPM, change the pistons to RPM. But that was a good example with the Lycoming. Nothing else changed. They say higher compression is 8-to-1 or higher. And so their Lycoming is going to range from a low of 6.5 to 1 up to 10 to 1. I just made a note. Remember, there's a difference between compression ratio and boost pressure. Don't ever confuse the two. The ratio is a number you need to compare two things. So, and then we go to the thing I started to talk about, but I shouldn't have. So we have compression ratio. How do you change compression ratio of an engine?
Change pistons.
You got to change the piston. And how does a pilot change compression ratio? He doesn't. He can call a mechanic. All right, so you can't change that's done by the factory. Change the so. Is a higher compression ratio better? Is good or bad? Good to a point because you get detonation. Why would an aircraft manufacturer? They know these things. They say, well, okay, we can run a compression ratio all the way up to 10 to 1 on the fuel we have. Why would they ever make something that's 6.5 to 1?
So they don't have to run such a more expensive fuel.
We only have one type of fuel. All you get is 100 low lead. We have one flavor.
Reliability?
That's not a bad answer. It made me think. They would never purposely make an engine less reliable, but the compression ratio definitely. Who said that, by the way? Yeah, compression ratio has a play in the time between overhaul. If you look at the time between overhaul of engines, between certain engines, like the 320 line, the higher compression ratio engines, I think, do have a shorter time between overhaul. So yeah, you could get a higher TBO out of it by going low compression. I think the simple answer is when you get into the lower compression engines, you usually find that they're turbocharged, and they're pushing more air into it anyway, and so you have a hotter air inside there, and I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. The air is hotter, which could give you detonation problems to begin with, so they decrease some of the compression ratio because you're boosting it anyway. So, all right, displacement. The FAA loves displacement questions. They have a lot of them. That is what I described earlier, the amount of liquid a cylinder displaces during one stroke. Well, that'd be the displacement of that cylinder. The displacement of the engine would be that cylinder times however many there are. So it is found by multiplying the area of the piston by the distance the piston travels. Times number of cylinders. And since area equals pi times the radius squared, that's the area, we could say that the area times, I'll just do the area times stroke times number of cylinders. Number of cylinders. All right, so what if we had an engine that had a 5.25 inch bore? Because when we talk about engines, we always talk about the bore. And the bore is how big around the cylinder is. So the bore is the same thing as the diameter. So 5.25 inches. So we have an engine that has a 5.25 bore, 5.2 inch 5 bore. It has a stroke of 4 inches. And it's a 6-cylinder engine. What is the displacement of this engine?
63 cubic inches?
63 cubic inches? I don't think so. What's step one?
5.25, make that a radius.
That is correct. Make 5.25 is a bore, which is the same thing as diameter. We need the radius. So it's 5.25 divided by 2 equals
2.65.
2.625. All right. So we do 2.625 times, squared times pi times 6. Times 4. That's right. Times 4 times 6. So we get 2.625 x squared equals times the pi symbol. What's that?
I already forgot to do the squared on the calculator.
It's the x squared next to the 7. Look to the left of the 7. 519.6. And we know that aircraft engines, they round it to the nearest 10. So what would we round it to? 520. So that sounds like a Continental IO 520 to me. All right. I don't have a bunch of examples for that. I just got to tell you, that's how it works. And the big trick to that, I mean, we do it over and over, but really where you're going to screw up, because if I have this on the test, I'm going to give you the formula. I will, something like, what would I put? I don't know what I'd put exactly. But where you're going to screw up is just this. I'm going to give you a bore, and you got to remember to divide that by 2. And then square it. So it's 2.625 squared, because area equals pi r squared. So we got to find the area. Area is pi times the radius, which in this case is 2.625. And we have to square that. Pi times the radius squared. So you're going to get 2.625. I'm sorry, you're going to get some other number multiplied by 4, multiplied by 6. I'll shut up before I just screw everybody up. All right, any questions on that one? Because I just went. Horsepower. All right. Where's my friend? You say horse pressure. Horsepower. That is work. It's how much work is being done. It is, what do you say? Work. It is work equals force times distance. When my son was in college, I visited him down in his school. We're sitting in the cafeteria, and his friend is there. And you'd have to know my son, he's a math major. And he's like me, but smart. And so he takes the trays. He's going to go, deliver them to the cafeteria place where you drop off your trays. And his friend's like, "Hey, dude, since you're going, can you take my plate? It's no extra work." My son's like, "That's literally the definition of work: force times distance." So yes, you've literally described work and then told me it's no work. So I'm like, hey, good joke. Okay, so work is force times distance. Let's see, work, well, that was 1. Definition 2, measurements. How do we measure this? Well, we can do the foot-pound. That is where you hit something on your foot. Which is not the definition I usually go with. I have 1 pound of mass raised 1 foot, because that's a foot-pound, which makes perfect sense to me. Then we get into the more common one, which is horsepower, which is based upon the work that an English workhorse could produce. It must be an English workhorse. It can't be anything other than an English workhorse. It can't be an English, what's the opposite of a workhorse? A show horse. Yeah, these are. So I know sometimes I tell you stories that are not true. This is actually true, although I may not get it completely correct. But, we'll do it this way. An English workhorse, an English workhorse could work at a rate of 550 foot-pounds per second, which is 33,000 feet per minute, or foot-pounds per minute. Remember that 33,000 from before? I forget what we're doing. So now that number will make sense to you a little bit. So the way this actually came about is, and I can't remember his name right off the top of my bat, but he's the guy who basically invented the steam engine, which I can't remember his name. And so he wants to sell the steam engine to, again, this is a true story, I'm just probably not getting the facts correct, wanted to sell the steam engine to mining companies. The mining company currently had this English workhorse, walk around in circle and move this thing. And so he wanted to sell them the steam engine. Well, in order to sell the steam engine, which was this newfangled convention thing, he had to convince the mining operators of how much work it could do. So to do that, he had to watch the horse and figure out how much work the horse did, which he could raise 550 pounds, 550 foot-pounds per second. It'd be 550 pounds, 1 foot every second, right? So that's what the horse could do. How he figured that out, I don't know. Then he figured, well, if it can do that in a second, well, then it can do 33,000 in a minute equivalent. So he had to create the steam engine to do the same thing, and so that's where we got the unit of horsepower for engines. But there was a joke I read, something about 1 horsepower. 1 horse is actually equivalent to how much horsepower is. I don't know. It'll come to me. Anyway, so which is to say that if we looked at it in formula form, is 1 horsepower equals how many foot-pounds per minute divided by 33,000, or per second divided by 550. So that's where we get horsepower from. There's actually different types of horsepower. That we shall talk about. One is indicated horsepower. Indicated. Indicated horsepower is this theoretical, mathematical calculation. So they should have changed the name to calculated horsepower. That would have made a lot more sense. So it's power produced in the cylinders without reference to friction loss. In order to do that, you must know the mean effective cylinder pressure. So uses the mean, meaning average, mean effective cylinder pressure. Which is the average pressure. Oops. Average pressure in the cylinder during the power stroke. So to calculate horsepower, which you will have to do, is easy. We're going to use a formula called, oops, that should be B, calculation. Formula is Planck, P, L, A, and K, which is P is indicated mean pressure in PSI. That's something somebody's going to have to give you. L, length of stroke in feet. That's a huge one. Because we looked at the 550 a little bit ago, had a stroke of how many inches? 4. But you got it now, it's 4/12. You got to divide by 12. You got to be in feet. I wonder how long it took him to figure that one out. It always comes out too much. Try it in feet. That worked. The area of the piston. And don't forget, let's see, in square inches. So we got something in feet, something in square inches, P-L-A-N. N is number of power strokes per minute. Now we are dealing with a 4-stroke engine. And if I had, for every twice that the crankshaft goes around, we have how many power impulses?
8.
If we have one cylinder.
1.
So it goes around twice, we have how many power impulses? 1. So if I'm going around 2 RPM, how many power strokes per minute do we have? 1. So it is for a 4-stroke. It is RPM divided by 2. PLANK. K is the number of cylinders. Because I don't know why they picked K. Because PLANN didn't work for them, so I say the number of cylinders.
7K.
All right, so let's try this out here.
Maybe it's supposed to be a C. Being weird.
What?
Maybe it's supposed to be a C. They're just being weird about it.
That would have been cool.
Plank with the C.
Plank with the C.
Numbers.
All right, let's try it out. We have a 6-cylinder engine. 6-cylinder engine. It has a 5.25-inch bore. It has a 4-inch stroke. This sounds familiar. And it runs at 2,700 RPM would be max RPM. So we'll calculate it there. And the IMEP, mean effective cylinder pressure, is 160 PSI. So what is my horsepower out of this engine? Well, let's try it here. P is indicated mean pressure. Why have I not actually given you the formula? All right, we'll work with this. P is 160. L is
Length of the stroke.
4 divided by 12 because it's in feet, which equals
0.34.
0.3333.
0.33.
Okay. The area of the piston. So it's 5.25 is my bore, so it's 5.25. Got to divide by 2 to get the radius. .625.
Yes.
So area equals pi times 2.625 squared. So I have the 2.65 x squared times the pi key equals 21.65 inches squared. PLAN is the RPM, number of power strokes. It's 270, but it's a four stroke, so we divide by 2. So it's 2,700 divided by 2 is 13. Let me write that. So 2,700 divided by 2 equals 1,350. PLANK, and the number of cylinders equals 6. All right, so we have all that. The formula is actually P times L times A times N times K divided by 33,000. And now you know where the 33,000 comes from. So 160 times 0.333 times 21.65 times 1,350 times 6 equals syntax error. 160 times 0.333 times 21.65 times 1,350 times 6 equals divided by 33 equals, what'd you get?
283.3.
283 point, that's what I got. So, although when I wrote it out earlier, I came up with 280. So, but the horsepower would be 283.13 is what I got? Okay. Now the reason why this is, say interesting, but may not be interesting to you, is you have to go back and now think about Planck. How do we affect the horsepower of an engine? It's got to be one of these things. So if I want to get more power out of this particular engine, what do I have to do? We can start right here with P. What do I have to do? And how would I increase the pressure?
Compression ratio.
Increase the compression ratio. If I get that 160 up even a little bit, I get more power. So I can increase the compression ratio, or what else?
And fuel.
No, I would say add fuel.
Add fuel charge, fuel air.
How else would we?
Add more fuel air, increase the pressure. So we can increase the pressure by the mean pressure by increasing the compression ratio, or we could put more air into it, forced induction, turbocharger, something else, whatever I got to do to get that pressure up. Okay, so increase the pressure. Well, we haven't got there yet, but L, it's kind of hard to increase the stroke, but you can. It just needs to do crankshaft,
Oh.
longer cylinders. So that's kind of a design thing. You know, we could open it up, we could change piston, increase the P, we could bolt on a turbocharger, bolt on a supercharger, that'll do it. We can get an air filter that breathes easier. We could redesign the intake chamber so that it doesn't have sharp bends and corners. We could change the induction system so that it's right behind the propeller and takes the prop blast in. You know, little things, but most of that's already done for you. All right, can't really do much about the length of the stroke, but area of the piston, only thing we could do there would be to
Bore out the cylinder.
bore it oversize. Well, we do bore stuff in aviation, but it's not to increase horsepower. It's just done to clean up cylinders. So in cars, what would be the most you could bore something over?
Typically 60,000.
Okay, which is not a lot. It's some. In aviation, you're not going to go, I think, 20 over is the most we ever go. And that's pretty rare. So we can go 20 over. So, yeah, not going to help. But as a perfect example, I have the 0470 on my aircraft. That's 470. The 520 has bigger diameter pistons. And so one of the mods that people do, a very common mod for the 0470, is they take the crankcase and they bore out the hole, you know, the holes where your cylinder went in. They bore that hole a little bit longer and bolt 520 cylinders on there. It's a very common mod. All right, so you can do that. All right, number of power pulses. What can we do here?
Increase RPM.
Increase the RPM. So as I said before, the Continental had the A65. Well, there was a mod to make it a 75 horsepower. It'd go from 65 to 75. All you did was you changed the piston part number and you changed the prop and you turned it faster. There was no, I don't think, any compression ratio change. It just, you turned it faster and boom, there you went. So if you turn it faster, you'll get more horsepower. And number of cylinders, you're not going to do much about that. So let's take a look at, you know, what do we have control over? You have a little bit of control over that, but not operational control as a pilot. But as a pilot, this is the only thing I can change. So you have to think about the fact that your horsepower is a direct relationship to how fast your engine is turning. So you take a 0200, the one they did the compression check on out there, that's a 100 horsepower engine. If you're only turning it at half its speed, then the horsepower is less. But here's something that, for whatever reason, I didn't even figure out until, I'd been a pilot for a long time. I've been a mechanic for a long time. I was an IA for a long time. And then one day it just kind of hit me. I'm like, hey, nobody ever taught me this. I wonder why. You take a fixed pitch prop engine, like the little 150s out there, and when you fly them at cruise RPM, cruise power. You want to cruise your aircraft at about 65, 70% power. Is that about what you do? Yeah, my 182, I always say about 65% power for cruise. You know, get to altitude. Hey, I'm going to go the next 4 hours. I'm just going to set up for 65. So when I learned to fly, all the CFIs I had were like, all right, so we take off, we take a power reduction, we take off, we're at red line, or, max RPM, climb, establish yourself, just pull it back to, see how it sounds kind of nice right there? That's probably about 65%. Or they would take the red line and multiply it times, 65% or whatever, 65% of the max RPM. Well, that's totally wrong. But if you actually read the pilot operating handbook, it's so clear and obvious. It says, well, take those little engines. So you take off and you can adjust the N for sure. But the pressure, what happens to pressure as I climb in altitude? Yeah, it's going to start going down just by the very nature of we go up. So for every 1,000 feet I climb, this 160 is going to go less and less and less and less. So if this continues to drop as a pilot, what do I have to do to maintain the same horsepower? I got to increase this. So really, if you read the pilot operating handbook, it'll tell you, if you take a little 150 up to, 7,000, 8,000 feet, you pretty much fly at wide open throttle, which sounds terrible because all you see is a tachometer. It's like, wow, that tach is way over there. That's not normal. That's like takeoff. But the pressure's so low that the engine's hardly working. So as you go up in altitude, you keep adding RPM to maintain. Here I was, I think all the times, I've been out there flying. We had a Cessna 140, and that's the owner always told me, I'll fly it around 2,400 RPM. It sounds good about there. Don't flog it. And I'm up there at 8,000 feet crossing the mountain going to LA. I'm like, man, I was probably, that was at 85 horsepower. I was probably like at 40 horsepower or something. Got to put the power into it. So, anyway, yeah. So, felt foolish when I figured that out. I'm like, nobody told me that. I should have figured that out on my own. All right, so let's see. Another minute. Okay, so there we go. We figured out how to do indicated horsepower. I don't know, just for fun because I thought it was fun. And to kind of expand upon that, Continental made two engines that were very similar. There's the O300, which would have went in some of the really old 172s, the 170s. That was very common. And then they made the Cessna 175, which is a pretty rare aircraft, and that had a GO 300. So cubic inches? Same. The O300 was 145 horsepower at 2,700 RPM, and the GO 300 was 175 horsepower. That's the Cessna 175 at 3,200 RPM. What's the difference? RPM. What's the G stand for? Geared. So they spun this thing a lot faster, but the prop can't spin that fast because the prop starts going supersonic. And then you lose all efficiency out of it, and it sets up cracks in it and pressure waves. So they just geared it, spun it faster, and out of the same amount of cubic inches, boosted it by, 30 horsepower? Yeah, let me see. And just for fun, I won't do it to you. I did the Planck thing, but I did it backwards because I knew LANK and horsepower, but I didn't know P.
Oh, variable.
So I took these numbers and I worked it backwards, and the P was very close doing the math. Same. About 141 IMEP on both of them. Actually, by math, I got like 141 on this one, and I think 145 on this one.
And that's just because it's geared, so they can run it at a higher RPM.
Higher RPM. So go back to here, and what do? They increase the N. Increase the N, you increase the horsepower.
Yeah.
So everything else is the same. The length is the same, the A was the same, the number of cylinders is the same, the pressure is the same. Just bumped it up, got more horsepower.
So you're saying there's no component difference between those, running a 32 versus 27?
Well, there's a gearbox up front. He had a big gearbox. And to be honest with you, I don't remember the piston part numbers if we changed
I
piston
mean,
part
like,
numbers.
you know, crankshaft journal size or anything strength-wise?
I don't think so, no.
So
It's
since I'm saying
possible.
I should be able to run that 2700 up to 32 without blowing it up.
Yeah, except the Geo had a gearbox up
Right,
front.
yeah, but that's only, the only change there is with the prop speed.
Yep.
So I'm saying that.
But the lower end was, yeah, I see what you're saying. Was the lower end, in effect, the same lower end? It's been so long since I built.
an engine typically to run higher RPM, I need strength and journal size and rod configuration and piston design, forged versus cast, or there's gotta be something in there that allows 3200 RPM to be a safe red line versus the 27.
I don't remember, because it's been a long time since I built either one of these engines, what the diameter of the journals were, but I think they were the same, or so close to be just like not worth talking about. But at the same time, 27 to 32 is not a lot.
And the engine's already over-engineered, so that
And they are.
you can absorb that. in.
Yeah.
So I kinda feel I wanna go out and run my 0320 at 3200.
Let's
see
do
how
it.
that-
Yeah. Try it.
It's your plane.
But this is a Continental 6-cylinder. You have a 4-cylinder. Totally different. You're going to have to take the Sawzall and cut the tips of your prop to get that RPM.
You can show prop, like, well,
Yep.
I have been doing things and then noticed that the pitch didn't sound quite right. I looked down at the tack and it was a little high.
On overspeed.
Always adjusted back.
All right, let's take a break.
Right.